You're going to think you know this story. A kid dies, the police have no clues, and the file gets thrown in a cabinet. End of story, right? Not this time. In 1997, Kingsport, a quiet place in East Tennessee, was a safe harbor. It was the kind of town where you didn't lock your doors. But on September 6th, that world cracked wide open. That's when 17-year-old James Hutson was found murdered in his own house, stabbed to death. His mother was there. She was alive, but shattered. The crime was brutal, senseless. Detectives found one thing, a faint trace of the killer's DNA. They ran it through every database they had. Nothing. The case went stone cold. For 27 years, the whole thing just sat there, frozen. The family lost hope. The killer thought he was safe. He was wrong. A new look at that old DNA, using a wild new science, didn't just find the monster. It proved he'd been living quietly, right next door, this whole time. Don't tell me you aren't hooked. You want to know who it was. I sure did. I want you to forget the crime for a minute. Forget the news story. That's what the police do. We're storytellers. We deal in people. And before he became a headline, before the word victim got stamped on his file, there was just James Hutson. Who was James? He was 17. That's the first thing you need to know. 17 is that strange, bright age where you're half kid, half adult. You're trying to figure out if you'll go to college, if you'll get that old truck running, and which girl you're going to ask to the next Friday night football game. You've got all your chips pushed onto the future. James was doing exactly that. He was a son, and he was a brother. His world revolved around his home on Rock Springs Road in Kingsport, Tennessee. It wasn't a fancy house. It was home. It was safe. And at the heart of that home was his mother, Mary Hutson. You've got to know Mary. Mary was the rock. She was described by everyone who knew her as a precious lady. That's a Southern term, and when people use it, they mean it. It means kind. It means tough but sweet. It means devoted. I think Mary was the kind of woman who always had a pitcher of sweet tea ready and knew every single thing James was up to and loved him anyway. Her life was focused on her children and on making that home on Rock Springs Road a little slice of quiet safety. Now, Mary was dealing with some heavy things herself. She was battling cancer, a fight that would sadly take her about a year after the attack on James. That fight tells you something about her spirit, doesn't it? She was already facing a monster, the biggest fear a person can have, and she was still putting her energy into raising her son and keeping things steady. James's sister, Emily Bartley, is the one who keeps his memory alive today. You hear her talk and you realize the wound never closed. She said, "It always feels like yesterday for me. I miss him so much still to this day." Think about that. 27 years later, and the grief still hits her like a new wave. That's the true measure of what was lost, a big brother who should have been there for family dinners, who should have been an uncle, who should have grown old and gray. He stuck at 17 forever.
In the fall of 1997, James was doing all the regular stuff. He was looking ahead to his last 2 years of high school. What was he thinking about? Probably driving, probably girls, maybe getting a part-time job to save up some cash. The details are small because they were normal, and that's what makes this story so hard. Normalcy was stolen. His entire life was just sitting there, waiting for him to pick it up, and some monster walked in and threw it all away. You have to understand the family's context to understand the scope of the crime. Kingsport wasn't some big, gritty city. It was the kind of place where things like this didn't happen. When James died, the whole town felt it. It was a violation of their safety. But more than that, it was the loss of a boy who was loved deeply by his mother and sister. This wasn't some random street crime where the victim was anonymous. This was a direct, brutal attack on the heart of the Hutson family, a family already fighting a tough personal battle with Mary's health. James was the bright spot, the everyday comfort. When he was killed, the light went out in that house. Mary lost her son. Emily lost her brother. The house was left with a hole in it that could never be filled. That's why we care. That's why this case matters 27 years later. We're not tracking a piece of evidence. We're chasing justice for the son and the mother who suffered the worst day imaginable. We're watching the clock run out on James Hutson's beautiful, unfinished life. You've met James. You know his mom, Mary. You know they were fighting big battles in a quiet home. Now we have to look at the day that peace ended. It's hard, but you can't understand the mystery if you don't stand in the dark right before the dawn. We're going to call it his last normal day, September 5th, 1997. What was James doing? He was a teenager. Maybe he was at school. Maybe he was hanging out with friends, joking about something dumb. We don't have a minute-by-minute transcript of his life that evening, and maybe that's a mercy. We just know that the clock was ticking down, and he had no idea. The lights probably went out early on Rock Springs Road. It wasn't a party house. Mary was fighting cancer. James was just a kid needing sleep. They were safe in their beds. They were home. That's the most important thing. Now, let's talk about the fog of time. The midnight hour. We don't know the exact second the killer broke in. He didn't send a warning. The news reports later used a simple word, intruder, but I don't like that word. An intruder sounds like a mistake that belongs there. This was a predator. The police determined later that this killer wasn't looking for James or Mary specifically. He was looking for money. It was supposed to be a robbery, a smash and grab. Get in, grab something, get out. But something went wrong. Something went terribly, violently wrong.
Imagine the sound in the house. Was it a breaking window? A door creaking? A shuffle of feet on the floorboards? James, at 17, was probably a deep sleeper, but someone must have woken up. And when they woke up, they didn't just find a thief. It's an image I can't shake. That quiet house on a quiet street in Kingsport suddenly erupting into pure panic. The attack. This is where the story turns from biography into a horror film, and you have to face it. James Hutson, just 17, came face to face with the man who had broken in. Maybe he was trying to protect his mother. Maybe he was just trying to escape. We don't know the heroics he attempted in those awful minutes, but we know the outcome. James was stabbed to death. He died in his own home. He died fighting a monster who came in to steal spare change. And the monster didn't stop there. His mother, Mary Hutson, the precious lady who was fighting for her life against cancer, was then sexually assaulted by the same killer. Think about the pure, raw terror of that event. Not only did she lose her son in front of her, but she was attacked by the killer. It strips away every ounce of safety, dignity, and humanity a person has. It's a violation that goes past the physical. It touches the soul. For Mary, this crime wasn't just a loss. It was the final, devastating weight placed on a woman already struggling to breathe under the pressure of a fatal illness. The stress and trauma of that night? We can't measure what it cost her in terms of her health and her fight against cancer, but you know it didn't help. Not one bit. The discovery and the clue. The police arrived at the Rock Springs Road home sometime that morning on September 6th. What they found was a slaughterhouse. The scene was horrific. The violence was way beyond what a simple break-in would call for. It shocked even the veteran officers of the Sullivan County Sheriff's Office. This wasn't just a homicide. This was an act of pure rage and destruction. The police had a murder, they had a sexual assault, and they had a whole community that had just realized that their safe harbor wasn't safe anymore. Every neighbor was now a suspect. Every stranger on the street was a threat. But in the middle of all that chaos, the original investigators did one thing right, one thing that saved this case 27 years later. They found the single crucial piece of evidence, a DNA sample from the unknown attacker.
Back in 1997, DNA was the cutting edge, but it had limits. They could get a profile, they could run it through the new federal database, CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, but if the killer wasn't already a convicted felon, the system said nothing. The computer just blinked back 0. The DNA profile told them who the killer wasn't, but not who he was. The case went cold because the technology hit a wall. The murder weapon was gone. The robbery loot was gone. The killer was gone. But that faint, tiny string of genetic code, preserved by smart, careful detectives, sat in an evidence locker.
Was it a jilted boyfriend of James's sister? They checked him out, ruled out by DNA. Was it a local drug addict who got violent? They had a list of usual suspects. They brought them in, took cheek swabs where they could. No match. Was it a transient thief passing through town? That's almost impossible to track down. They burned through leads. They followed up on tips phoned in by panicked neighbors. They checked alibis. They looked at everyone who had a motive, or no motive at all. This went on for weeks, then months. I think the hardest part of being an original detective on a case like this is the moment you realize you've run out of road. You know who the person is, genetically speaking, but you can't put a name to the profile. You've done every physical check, followed every tip, and all the paths lead back to a locked door. The freeze. The case didn't just go cold overnight. It was a slow, painful descent into a deep freeze. The case file moved from the active desk drawer into the cold case cabinet. It got wrapped up in a nice ribbon of red tape and filed away. Every once in a while, a new piece of evidence would be found in another state, and the police would pull out the Hutson file, run the DNA profile again, and hope for that ping. Every time, they were let down. Years turn into a decade. Mary Hutson passes away a little over a year after the attack. She never got to see justice for her son. The emotional devastation of the crime coupled with her cancer fight. I don't think she ever had a chance to truly heal. Her pain was compounded, and then she was gone. The case didn't just hurt the living. It silenced the victim who could tell the story. By the early 2000s, this case wasn't just old. It felt unsolvable. The original detectives who had given their blood and sweat to the case started to retire. They walked away, knowing that the killer of James Hutson was still walking free. They left a piece of their soul in that file cabinet, forever haunted by the one they couldn't catch. Can you imagine that? Closing out a career and knowing that monster is still out there, sipping coffee, going to work, breathing the air while James is dead and buried? It's a professional nightmare. The technology of the time, the best they had, failed them. CODIS was a great tool, but it had a massive, crippling limitation. It could only find killers who had already been caught. It offered no help for the smart, clean criminal. So, for 27 years, the family endured a devastating silence. The killer was a ghost. The only witness was a silent, invisible strand of DNA that no one could read properly yet. The case sat, the stack of paper getting thicker, but no closer to the truth, just waiting for the world and science to finally catch up. You felt that frustration, didn't you? That's what James Hutson's family felt every day. The killer was safe. For now. When a crime like this happens in a small town, a dark thing sets in. It's not just fear of the monster. It's the cold realization that no one can be trusted. The community was already reeling from the shock of James' murder and Mary's assault. Then, about a year later, the town felt another terrible loss. Mary Hutson, who had fought so hard, finally succumbed to cancer. You can bet that the unending pain and trauma of losing her son and being attacked in her own home hastened her end. The killer didn't just take James's life, he took Mary's peace, and I think he shortened her time too. So the Hutson family grieved twice. The community was broken, and the police, they were stuck in that awful silence. They had the DNA, but no name. The man next door. While all of this pain was unfolding, the man who did it didn't flee town.
He didn't suddenly grow a beard and move to another state. He stayed right there. His name was George Robinson. He was a Kingsport resident. He was just another face in the crowd. Think about the audacity of that, the pure cold arrogance it takes to commit a murder, to violate a woman, and then go back to your routine. He was right there on Hillview Drive, living his life. Was he interviewed by the original cops? Almost certainly. The police knocked on every door in the area, and I can picture the scene. Robinson opens the door, he's calm. He tells the detective, "No, I didn't see anything suspicious that night. It's a terrible thing." He probably shook his head, maybe even offered some hollow sympathy. He was questioned like everyone else, and because he wasn't a felon, his DNA wasn't in CODIS. He would have been cleared almost immediately. That's the horror of this kind of cold case. The killer blends in. He waits in the checkout line behind you at the grocery store. He drives past the Hutson home every week. He might have even helped the family search for James's missing things or offered condolences to Mary's friends. He becomes a phantom, hiding in the most obvious place, plain sight. For 27 years, George Robinson had a secret that only he, James, and the DNA sample knew. Every day, he woke up believing his secret was buried forever beneath the silence of a cold case file. He thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. He was just a regular 60-year-old man in Kingsport. That's all the world saw. The monster was a quiet neighbor. You can't tell me that isn't the scariest kind of killer, the one you never see coming, the one who just walks away and lives his life while the victim's family is left with nothing but questions. But the evidence wasn't dead. It was just waiting for the right moment. The spark. You've sat through the long, frozen night of the investigation. You know the file. You know the name of the victim, James, and his mother, Mary. You know the killer was an invisible man who walked free for nearly 3 decades. That's the pain of a cold case. It just sits there, mocking everyone. But the world changes. Science changes.
For 26 years, that box sat in the evidence room. That box held the police report, the old photos, and the key, that tiny, silent vial of DNA from the killer. It was the only voice James and Mary had left, but it couldn't talk to the old CODIS machine. The new blood. Then comes 2023. You've got a new crop of people at the Sullivan County Sheriff's Office. They're looking at these old files, these old failures. They're thinking, why didn't this work? They weren't haunted by the same walls the old detectives hit. They saw a new road. They linked up with the TBI Cold Case Initiative. It was a fresh look, a new way of thinking. And their focus wasn't on hunting down old witnesses or digging up old suspects. Their focus was on that one single brilliant piece of evidence, the killer's DNA. They knew the old tech was useless. CODIS was great if the guy was already in jail for something else. But what if he wasn't? What if he was just living his life, quiet and clean? That's what George Robinson had been doing. So the detectives made a bold, smart move. They sent the 1997 sample, that precious, decades-old evidence, to a private lab. Not just any lab, but Othram, Inc., a place that specializes in the science of the impossible. The spark, FGG. This is the turning point. This is the moment the dark night breaks. The technique they used is called Forensic Genetic Genealogy, or FGG. If you don't know the term, you should. It's what's catching all the monsters who thought they were safe. It's the new sheriff in town. You're probably thinking, wait, what's the difference? The difference is everything. CODIS is a mugshot book of criminals. FGG is a family tree of the whole world. Instead of comparing the killer's DNA to a database of felons, Othram scientists built a genetic profile that they could upload to public genealogy sites. Think Ancestry.com or 23andMe. not the private locked-down ones, but the ones people sign up for to learn where their great-great-grandlaw came from. This technology isn't looking for the killer himself. It's looking for his cousins, his distant, completely innocent relatives who were just trying to learn about their family history. And it works like this. The killer's DNA is uploaded, the site runs the match, ping! It finds someone, maybe a third cousin, maybe a second cousin twice removed, living 1,000 miles away. That cousin has no idea they're related to a monster, but the match is undeniable. That one tiny ping was the key. It was the one new thing that changed everything. For 26 years, the case was ice. In 2023, the science brought the heat. Othram did its job. They built the profile. They found the relatives. And suddenly, the case wasn't a cold file anymore. It was a roadmap. It was a family tree pointing right back to Kingsport.
The killer was no longer a ghost. He was a puzzle waiting to be solved. And the puzzle box was his own family history. The police now had a handful of names. Innocent names. And they had to work backwards to find the one rotten apple on the branch. It was a massive, quiet shift in the whole investigation. The killer had been quiet and safe for almost 3 decades, but his family had just unwittingly signed his death warrant, and the detectives knew exactly where to look next. They had a name, and that name was George Robinson. The quiet neighbor, the man who saw nothing, the man who thought he was safe. That little ping from the genealogy database, that's not the end of the story. It's just the starting gun. When you're dealing with forensic genetic genealogy, you don't get a clear name and address. You get a set of potential family members. You get, say, a third cousin in Ohio and a second cousin once removed in Florida. None of these people are the killer. They're just innocent folks who decided to spit in a tube and upload their DNA to find out if they had any Viking blood. The job of the cold case team now turns into something like a huge, morbid census project. Building the tree of death. The TBI agents and the Sullivan County detectives had to become historians. They had to work with genealogists, people whose whole job is building family trees, and work backward. The FGG test gave them the distant branches of the tree. Their job was to follow the trunk. They had to start tracing birth records, marriage licenses, death certificates, and old newspaper clippings. They were building a massive family tree, a literal roadmap of George Robinson's relatives. They're crossing out women, unless they were looking for a son or brother, and tracing the male line down. Imagine the work. It's not a 10-minute internet search. It's months of patient, grinding work to find the common ancestor, the great-grandparent who ties the killer's DNA to the innocent cousin's DNA. Once they found that common ancestor, they started tracing all the direct descendants. They narrowed the list. They crossed out people who were too young to have committed the crime in 1997. They crossed out people who had solid, verifiable alibis or who had already died before James Hutson was murdered. And as they got closer, as the branches got shorter, a few names kept popping up in the Kingsport area. They kept tracing the male line generation after generation until they had a very short list. And right there, at the very center of their suspect pool, was a name they knew, but had never considered. The name of the quiet neighbor who'd been interviewed back in 1997 and cleared. George Robinson. It's the ultimate twist, isn't it? The man who had likely been asked by police if he saw anything? The man who had been hiding in the shadow of the crime for 27 years? He was the logical answer, genetically speaking, but you can't just arrest a man because a distant cousin's DNA says you should. They needed proof. New proof. The surveillance. This is where the story turns into a spy thriller. The detectives had to be sure. They couldn't walk into court on a genealogy chart alone. So they put George Robinson under intense, secret surveillance. They had to watch his every move.
Robinson had no idea his carefully constructed wall of silence was about to crumble.
He was just going about his life on Hillview Drive, going to the store, maybe getting gas. He was the perfect suspect for one reason. He was sloppy because he was confident. He thought he was untouchable. The police were hunting for what's called abandoned DNA. They needed something he threw away, something that proved he was George Robinson and not just a name on a computer screen. Think about what people throw away every day. A discarded cigarette butt, a used paper plate, a coffee cup he tossed in a trash can at a convenience store. That's what they were looking for. The evidence was right there, in the garbage. The TBI agents got what they needed. They grabbed that discarded item, a coffee cup, maybe a napkin he used, and they rushed it to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Forensic Lab. The final confirmation. This is the end of the mystery, the end of the silence. The TBI forensic scientists in the lab took the DNA from the cup or the cigarette. They compared that new, fresh sample from George Robinson to the old, preserved sample from the 1997 crime scene. It was a perfect match. The reports came back conclusive. The DNA profile developed from the violent scene in 1997, the DNA of the man who murdered James Hutson and sexually assaulted his mother, Mary Hutson, was a 1 in a billion match for George Robinson. He was the man. The science had done its job. The genotree didn't just point to a suspect, it provided the final undeniable evidence. The killer was now named. George Robinson's long run was over. The cold case wasn't just warm, it was burning hot. The police had their killer, and the only thing left to do was go get him. The genetic evidence came back. It was a lock. George Robinson was the man who killed James Hutson and brutalized Mary Hutson 27 years ago. The clock stopped ticking for George Robinson on Wednesday, November 20, 2024. A grand jury, a group of citizens who look at the evidence, saw the TBI's proof and said, yes, this is the killer. They returned indictments charging him with 3 counts of first-degree murder. You've got to understand, they didn't just charge him with the actual murder, they charged him with felony murder because the killing happened while he was committing another felony, like the burglary and the sexual assault. He was cooked. The final showdown. Detectives didn't wait. They moved that same morning. They went to George Robinson's apartment on Hillview Drive in Kingsport. They weren't coming for an interview this time. They were coming to take him in forever. But Robinson wasn't gonna go quietly.
He knew. The second the police lights hit his window, he knew the 27-year game was over. He barricaded himself inside his apartment. He wasn't going to face the music. The police had to call in the Sullivan County SWAT team. Think about that scene. A quiet Kingsport street, 27 years after a killing, is suddenly crawling with heavily armed police, trying to talk a 60-year-old man out of his home. For several hours, the SWAT team tried to negotiate. They talked to him. They reasoned with him. They begged him to surrender. But Robinson said no. He refused to cooperate. He had spent half his life hiding this secret. He wasn't going to let the world see the real him in a courtroom. Finally, the police had no choice. They had to make entry. The moment the SWAT team breached the door, the confrontation ended. George Robinson shot himself. He was rushed to a local hospital for treatment, but it was over. The man who had been free for nearly 3 decades, the quiet neighbor who fooled everyone, died from his self-inflicted injuries. The community was stunned. The news hit Kingsport like a physical blow. The man they knew, the man they walked past, was the monster. But the sense of shock quickly gave way to a powerful, cold truth. George Robinson would never stand trial. There would be no long, painful court dates. There would be no cross-examination of Mary's sexual assault.
There would be no agonizing testimony about James's final moments. Robinson took the easy way out. He denied the Hutson family the closure of seeing him convicted and sentenced. But you know what? The case was still closed. Robinson's death was a full admission of guilt. The DNA was the evidence. The suicide was the confession. For James's sister, Emily Bartley, the moment was deeply emotional. She spoke about the detectives, the ones who never gave up, the ones who kept pulling that file out of the cold case cabinet. She said, "These are happy tears, but these are also tears of missing my family. I'm just so thankful for them to always continue to think, not just about the victims, but think about us, the family members." That's the core of it. The investigators didn't just solve a puzzle. They freed a family. They validated their grief. They honored James's short life and Mary's brutal end. It wasn't a celebration. How can you celebrate when you've lost so much? But for the first time in 27 years, the Hutson family finally had a name for the ghost that haunted their lives. They had the truth. They had the science. And in that strange, terrible way, they had justice. The case of James Hutson and Mary Hutson was finally over. The only witness who remembered the killer, the DNA, had finally spoken.
If the disturbing truth of this case shocked you as much as it did us, don't let this conversation end here. Drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching us from. If you appreciate deep dives into true crime, be sure to hit the like button and share this story with a friend. Finally, if you haven't already, subscribe for more investigations and analyses. We'll catch you next time.